Welcome to my podcast, Today's Dream, Tomorrow's Reality. My name is Vicki Poole. I'm a master transformational coach and hypnotist specializing in habit change. And this podcast is sponsored by the Enlightened Peach, and it's all about embracing our mosaic life. And some of you may ask, what is a mosaic life anyway? Well, it is recognizing that all the pieces of our life, the good, the bad, the indifferent, have all come together to make us who we are. Change any one thing and we are different. With that in mind, I invite you to embrace your perceived imperfections and celebrate who you are. This podcast is unedited and raw, just like life. And I am your host, and I have a special guest today I'll introduce in just a moment. But before I do that, I would love to ask you to leave a comment on this episode and do me a solid and remember to like, subscribe, and share because I want to have a bigger audience for all of my amazing guests, and that happens through you. So make sure you remember, like, subscribe, and share. All right. So now let's get started. So this lovely lady, I'm going to go ahead and bring her out, is Laura Carney. And we know each other because I've been involved in a group that a lot of you have heard me talk about before with Stacy Lauren, the Do the Thing. And she had a Do the Thing bucket list challenge. And it was all because of Laura's beautiful book. And so I would love to have you just introduce yourself, Laura, tell just a little bit about you, not the whole thing, just a little bit. And then that way we can kind of dive into some different questions and everything. And what's your cat's name, by the way?
My cat, Pinky, she's Pinky. Taken to being extra noisy if I'm on an interview.
Hey, I used to have a dog that would snore so loud that everybody could hear him. So that's all right. You go right ahead.
Hopefully she'll be a little tame during this interview. But this is my book, My Father's List. And it's about how I spent 6 years of my life from the ages of 38 to 44 finishing the bucket list of my late father, which we discovered. My brother actually found it just in some of his things when he moved into his first house. And he and his fiance framed it and gave it to me as the wedding gift, he called me his best lady at his wedding. And of course, he was the man of honor at mine. And, as soon as I saw it, I knew this wasn't just a family heirloom, which we didn't even know about. We didn't know my dad had anything resembling a bucket list. And I actually viewed my father as a person who was very creative, a huge dreamer, and often found it difficult to follow through with a lot of his dreams or to feel like he had succeeded and then would just sort of move on to the next. So to find that he was this organized and he actually wrote down, 60 intentions at the age of 29, we found out he wrote it just around the time I was born. Okay. It was like just such a surprise in that way. But at the same time, it was just this lovely reminder of who he was, because some of the items were just poetic and funny, like swim the width of a river, the way he said it, or ride a horse fast.
Poetic language. I love it. Yeah.
Grow a watermelon. I mean, he had, during my journey finishing the bucket list, we went to London at one point, and then we also went to Ireland. And even though that was not on the list, my dad was very Irish, and I learned about the storytelling tradition in Ireland. They call themselves, I believe it's pronounced Shanachi. And it's just, they were very poetic in the way that they would tell these sometimes tall tales, but mostly the mythology and history of Ireland. And I thought, oh, that's where he gets it from. Because he was the kind of person who, when he would tell a story and when he spoke, you knew he was just a lover of words. And he was trying to perfect the way he was saying them, and just very poetic. And he was a singer as well. And he was an entertainer and a comedian. I think in many ways, some of his greatest legacies were my brother and me having those same talents and trying to develop them in our own lives. And he certainly tried to help us see them when he was alive. And, I had struggled with his death. I think mostly in my case, because it happened when I was 25, it happened in a way that made me feel somewhat victimized by something silly and everyday, like someone using a phone. And it was
Now, so
because of a teen.
go ahead and tell a little bit. I can hear me echoing for some reason.
Oh,
Can
I'll
you
turn the
hear it?
volume down.
Okay. It was, whoop. But I want you to just kind of take a step back for a second,
Sure.
and let's talk about, were you close to your father?
Oh yeah, I was
You
very
were?
close with him, but I didn't see him as much as I wanted to because my
Yeah,
parents
because you had a
divorced when I
step.
was
They
6.
were divorced, and you had a stepdad, right?
I do, yeah.
Okay. Okay.
And regardless, I think my father made a special effort to just get as much quality time with us as he could. So we did always feel just very, when we were there with him, we were his world. But
Wonderful.
but also he had a double life. He was a closeted crossdresser, so
Okay.
he was sort of living another world that we didn't know about, and I didn't know about that at all until I was 18, and my brother didn't know until a little bit later. But I think that was actually part of the reason why we were sort of what's the word for it? Not compartmentalized, but segmented.
Mm-hmm.
Like we really
You
were
had to
his whole.
separate the lives.
Yeah, I mean, we
Yeah.
really were his whole world. I have no doubt about that. Like we were his North Star. We were his constant. But at the same time, he was living in a time where his gender identity wasn't very well accepted. And I don't know how he felt about it because I never got to have that conversation with him. And, for me personally, as I began writing the book about all of my experiences doing his bucket list, I started understanding there was something deeper going on inside of me that I felt I needed to express, which
Mm-hmm.
was that I realized that as a young woman dealing with my own diagnosis of clinical depression and feeling somewhat stigmatized about that, I was developing almost like a kindred spirit bond with my dad, who simultaneously had this double life that he had never told anybody about. I mean, maybe he told someone along the way besides my mom, but I think his girlfriend might have known. I don't really know, but we were both struggling like side by side and not able to discuss it and not able to talk
Yeah.
about it. And I think exploring that part of him, I joined a support group for it. I began to understand better what it's like when a straight man has that. And understanding it better and forgiving certain things, with some of the decisions he had to make. It helped me to do that with my own stigma about myself. And like,
Mm-hmm.
I really do feel beyond getting to have this incredible legacy now of, I get to inspire other people to live intentionally through my example or to find a positive way to work through grief because of what I did. But I also get to talk about self acceptance. And I
Yeah.
think that that's what my father would be the most proud of.
I think so. And, because that is a really big struggle for a lot of people. And they spend their lives living a totally different thing than what they would want. Now, your father was a crossdresser, but he was not gay, right? Or was
Right.
he?
Yeah.
Right. So I just can't even imagine there are people, that are gay and have to pretend that they're straight. And so that's another level on top of that. And so it's a big deal. And, it is really enlightening to see that your father had the wherewithal to make this list. And even if did he do any of those things that you know of, or were they all bucket list things that he never did?
He did 5 of them.
5 of them?
Yeah.
Okay.
So he had it his whole life. I
Yeah.
found out only recently he had it in his wallet when he died,
Oh my
which just
gosh.
gives me chills because it's like
Yeah.
that probably means that every Wednesday and Sunday when I was with him, he had it on him. Like I
Yeah.
was around this list my whole life
Yeah.
and didn't even know.
That kind of gives you tingles, doesn't it?
Yeah, because they always say things like that about when someone passes away. If you have one of their personal possessions, it's almost like you're having a connection with their spirit. And it's hard. You'd be hard pressed, I guess, to find something more personal than that.
Yeah. Because how old did you say he was when he wrote it?
29
29.
when I
Yeah.
was born. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then
And
he
you
died when I
wonder,
was 25.
yeah, you wonder what's going on in his mind when you're being born and all of a sudden he says, "Oh my gosh, I've been wanting to do these things. I'm going to go ahead and make my list," you know? Did you go to that place? Cuz I know that would be my first thoughts, right?
Yeah, I think Probably just I imagine he was in just an extremely enthusiastic moment when
Yeah,
he
yeah.
came, which
Everything's
he was known
possible.
for. What'd you say?
Everything's possible.
Yeah, exactly. And
Yeah.
he had a tendency to kind of swing between those, and sometimes he would be a little bit more reserved, and I think he probably had depression as well, and
Hmm.
related to that in me, even though we didn't really talk about it very much. But yeah, he probably was. Even beyond his emotional state and whatever, he wrote a poem when I was born. He used to write poetry for my brother and me all the time, and my mom. Even beyond that, though, I think, he was extremely well read,
Hmm.
and he read a lot about, well, I think law of attraction types of things, like
Okay.
Neville Goddard,
Oh, I love
Napoleon
Neville
Hill.
Goddard. Yeah.
Yeah, like just the whole idea. One of my favorites these days is Florence Scovel Shinn.
Oh, yes. I have her whole
Miracles will
library.
follow me. Yeah, what did you say?
I have her whole library.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Isn't she
Yeah.
great?
Oh, amazing. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't even discover that he read those things. All I knew that he liked was Dale Carnegie, how to
Okay.
influence people, because
Yeah.
he was a salesman. So he would
Yeah.
have been studying how to talk to other people. And he could have persuaded anybody of anything. That's how he was. But to learn after his death, based on his notebooks, that he also was a fan of Napoleon Hill and these kinds of people, it was like, oh, I'm getting this whole new philosophy now that I didn't even know about. He was very invested in your energy and how your energy affects your life. But I think for him it was just like he just got bored really easily. So he was always moving from one thing to the next. I mean, so that's why this bucket list, it has a variety of things on it.
Yeah. Well, it's probably because he's such a creative person. Creative people seem to have that, shiny object syndrome, a squirrel, and because I know I do the same thing. I really have to reel myself in a lot of times because I will get like, I'll have to share. I've got a book here that I'm reading, and I had started reading it before a long time ago, and somebody mentioned it on a live that I was at, and I thought, well, I'm going to find that book. And I had two of them. So obviously it had happened more than once. And both of them had like a bookmark in there where I'd stopped reading that one. And then I had read on the other one. I guess I
Oh,
bought the
story
second
of my
one,
life.
And so, so I can get that, just starting things and not stopping. So right now I'm almost finished with this book. And I said, okay, this time I'm finishing it and I'm going to donate the extra one to Goodwill.
Yeah, I mean, I remember he said to me once, this might have even been my 25th birthday. He said, Laura, you're just like me. You just love novelty. And, at that time, I had just been like diagnosed with ADHD. And, I'm thinking, oh, this is a problem. like,
Yeah.
like what he's saying is I'm a person who can't commit. And like him, I'm just going to chase after dreams and not finish them. Of course, now I don't see it that way at all, because that was one of the gifts that doing his bucket list gave me.
Mm-hmm.
Only a person who loves novelty could have done this.
Yes. Yes.
Because
Well,
it's 54 versions of novelty.
I'm quite impressed that you did the list because some of them were not the easiest thing. Because I was going back over your book a little bit, and I was reading about your skydiving adventure just right before you got on here, and that one, it's like, oh, it's a great thing, but I don't know that I could do it.
Well, the thing about it was I think part of it was because of my activism. So for a couple of years, I was giving speeches in schools, and I was teaching what I had learned. And, the things that I learned about distracted driving, I thought were really interesting because they just weren't being spread in the media.
Yeah.
Just that even making a phone call, because in my dad's case, it wasn't a texting driver. It was someone who was making a phone call. So like even doing that is too much for you to
Hmm.
actually be fully there. And yeah, okay, maybe you'll have a drive back to your house and nothing will be on the road and nothing will happen. You could assume that, but at the same time, you just don't know.
Yeah.
And I think that it's true that most car crashes happen like within a 5 mile radius of the person's house, because it
Hmm.
is situations like that. So that's what I was learning about. And I was kind of pushing myself out of my comfort zone when I would go and speak about this, because I hadn't really spoken about the way my father died in about 10 years when I did that. And I just was kind of just dipping my toes in the water with trying to take something that had been tragic and making it meaningful and making it something that could help other people. So I think that by the time the list showed up, and by then I had already, I'd published an essay in the Washington Post, I published something in Runner's World. Like the weirdest thing would happen every time I pitched a story that involved my dad and involved this issue, people would say yes. And it was like big publications. And that had never happened to me before. Yeah. So even though I worked for one, I worked for Good Housekeeping as a copy editor, not as a writer. So as I got to the point where I was ready to jump out of a plane, all I thought was, well, this is my activism. Like I can say, hey, look at this scary thing I did. By the way, this was actually safer than if you were driving home tonight and you made a choice where you didn't think you really had to be there. And to me, I saw the dichotomy of that, because if you're going to skydive, you're probably going to be hyper vigilant. Like I saw a piece of a parachute hanging out of my tandem jumper's pack, and I'm like, is that okay? Like I'm trying to keep myself as safe as possible so I don't die doing this. When in reality, and I just laughed when I read this later, in reality, the statistics are so low of somebody dying from doing that, as opposed to the high number of people who die from car crashes. So I felt like I was doing it for something so much bigger than me in that way. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, the way the list worked was no matter how scary I thought something was or how impossible I thought it was, I had committed to doing it, no matter how many years it took, no matter how much money it took. And luckily, at some point, one thing that started happening was I began to realize that my experiences were turning into a story. And usually whatever I gained from the list item, whatever the lesson was, once I figured out what the lesson was, I realized, oh, okay, that's why this one had to happen. And I could start as a writer piecing it together. Oh, this is this part of the story. And sometimes there were things like own a large house and our own land, which I thought, I don't know how we're going to do that. Yeah. And we did it poetically during the pandemic where we couldn't travel anymore. So we went and my husband bought a tent, and it was an extra large tent. And I was reading Walden at the time, and Walden Thoreau said the only large house he'd ever owned was a tent. So like those things happened simultaneously. And I realized, oh my God, this is my large house. Like I looked it up in the dictionary, and technically it's just a house is a shelter, so it was true. And it didn't have to be my literal definition of what it was. And mainly it was about the feeling. Like, am I getting the feeling of home from being in this large tent with my husband during a pandemic when I think there's bears outside and he's protecting me? Am I getting the feeling my dad would have wanted to have by having that large house? And I thought, yes, I was. So I was getting the lesson regardless of how literal it was.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you about the distracted driver, if you don't mind. And because I don't remember a lot of stuff about your book. That's why I was trying to peruse it just a little bit before we got on here. But I know that wasn't the distracted driver was like 16 or 17 or something.
17, right? Yeah.
17. Okay. And so they were talking on the phone, or they were making a phone call?
They were lost. They pulled off the highway. They made on a ramp. They made a phone call at a red light, and then drove through the next red light.
Ah, okay.
And the next red light was the one my dad was turning left at.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that was coming to mind for me is, I'm a hypnotist. And one of the things that I talk to people about is how we go through our life a lot of times on autopilot that, driving is one of the major ones where you drive the same path every day. And sometimes you get where you're going and you don't even remember the trip. And so one of the things that I'll tell people is to take a different route or do something to keep themselves more alert into the space of this is what I'm doing. So sometimes that may mean it's cold outside and you put the window down a little bit, or you change the kind of music that you're listening to or any kind of thing. So when you were talking to people about the distracted driving, did you give them like things to do, or were you just trying to make them aware? Or did you
At
do
the
both?
time, what'd you say?
I said, or did you do both? I don't know.
Well, the idea I was presented with the way I was trained was that we really just needed to tell the story about what
Okay.
happened in our particular case. And I always sort of felt like I want to tell more than the moment of my dad's death.
Right.
Because I think if you hear enough of those stories, it can start to feel like you can even start to tune out from that,
Yeah. Right.
and that doesn't have anything to do with how difficult that person's loss was and how tragic the death was, because a lot of times it is kids. So it has nothing to do with how well the story is told, or who's telling it. It's just that you've heard it enough times. And I wanted to tell something different.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to tell something that would appeal to people for other reasons.
Right.
And maybe that part of it would sort of just slip in. So I think that that's why when I started writing the book, it felt more like the right thing for me to do as opposed
Mm-hmm.
to what I had been doing. But, it's interesting what you bring up about helping people to not be on autopilot, because I think that that's probably true when it's people. I have a friend, my mentor Joel teaches kids to talk to their parents about it and to say, hey, mom, dad, like, I'm not okay with this when you do
Mm-hmm.
this, because that,
Mm-hmm.
I think, and he has learned, is very effective. And his daughter died, she was only 21, because of a distracted truck driver.
Okay.
So I think that's very helpful. But I think in the situation, I guess I'll never know. But in the
Mm-hmm.
situation with my dad, the way I perceived it was that this girl was panicking, was probably, I assume she was late. I don't know if she was. That's just me. And
Yeah.
especially when I was 17, I was always running late.
Yeah.
So I would imagine if you're in an emotional state where, and she had two siblings in the car with her. So if you're trying to get your siblings somewhere, and I think she was the oldest too. So it's like you're the responsible one and you've just learned to drive and you also now have your own cell phone. And that's just an unfortunate,
Mm-hmm.
concurrence of events in 2003 when people didn't know very much yet.
Right.
So I think that's what it was. And I think for that reason, that's why a lot of the themes in my book revolve around what it means to be lost. They revolve around what is it to navigate your own life, your own way, because I've always felt that part of why my dad died was because someone was lost
Yeah.
and needing it to be fixed, not
Mm-hmm.
wanting to figure it out on their own. And there have been so many things with his bucket list that I've had to figure out. Because really, I mean, when I went to we didn't really have an official trial for her because she was a minor. We
Mm-hmm.
just had like one day in court where they said they were going to fine her a certain amount of money. But I remember thinking like that could have been me. I've used my phone. Well, I mean, I don't anymore, of course, but back then I did because I didn't
Mm-hmm.
know yet. And she was so close to my age that it was very difficult for me to vilify her.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, accidents happen, and it's possible that even if she wasn't using her phone and she was lost, she could have been looking at everything else and still gone through the red light. Um, so,
Yeah, that's true. But what we
yeah.
teach in activism is that really only like 5% of car crashes are true accidents, meaning
Okay.
meaning
Most
like, an act of God, or, a tree falls on your car, or you
true.
couldn't have anything to do with it. But if you do make a choice that is, that that you've been educated about, that could potentially endanger you or other people, we just call them car crashes. So
Yeah,
like
I can
you'll
understand
never
that.
hear me call my dad's crash an accident.
Okay, I understand that. I
Yeah, if
thank you
that
for
makes sense.
that correction
Sure.
because yeah. Um, so let's go ahead and start telling us how you got started with the bucket list and what was the first thing that you did.
The first thing that I did was run 10 miles straight.
Okay.
Technically, I mean, it's kind of tied. I did run 10 miles straight, and then I also did visit LA, and then I also did have my picture in a national magazine. I did all three of them at first. They all sort of happened together. And when I found the list and decided, okay, I'm really going to do this, I started to blog about it. And I had already convinced my editor at Good Housekeeping to run a story about distracted driving. And then she saw what I was writing about finding this bucket list. And she said, well, we want something personal in the story. And then her editor decided, well, this should be the whole story. And we'll make the sidebar be the safety information. So I was shocked by that, just because I was a copy editor. You know, I wasn't there as a writer. And now I have this 3-page feature in a national magazine. So that was how his picture got into a magazine, which I'm sure was not how he ever thought that was going to go. And it was kind of this, there was this real concurrence of events where I started training for the LA Marathon, which by the time we found the list, I was already signed up for. Because I had already done the New York Marathon. I had recently become a long distance runner, and I thought, well, I'll just do LA too. And I wanted to do something to help young girls because I was getting so much benefit out of running. It just was raising my self-esteem. It was making me more confident. So I was going to raise money for Girls on the Run. And then we found the list, and I saw the list item that said run 10 miles straight. And I assumed he meant without walking at all. I had never done that, because I had done a marathon, but there's a lot of walking that I did. So I thought, well, I'll just run the first 10 straight, and then I'll kind of like walk some of the remaining 16. And then my friend who lives in LA said that was nuts. And, she would be happy to run it with me, because we found out you could do it relay style. So then she also raised money for Girls on the Run. And it was this beautiful experience, because I think our doing that ended up just by accident inspiring her daughter, who loved to run, who was 4 years old, and my niece, who then joined Girls on the Run herself, and she was 9 years old. And she even requested my bib number because she wanted to be like Aunt Laura. And to do it in LA, which was also a list item, on my first day getting there and I got my bib, I also saw that issue of Good Housekeeping on the newsstand with my dad's picture in it. So it was a great entry into this project. I'll put it that way, because my best friend here is helping me. And the list item I'm doing is not just a self-centered act, but rather it's touching somebody else's life who's also learning from the experience.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful. I love when all these little synchronicities come together and happen to reinforce that, yes, this is exactly the path that I'm supposed to be on. Yeah, that's beautiful.
Yeah, well, and, when we were talking earlier about car crashes, I didn't say it to correct you. I said it because one of the things I struggled with after my dad died was the notion that it was an accident. Just the notion that this had happened for no reason. And he just was unlucky. Because I felt the same way when I learned about my parents' divorce. Like I didn't know about this for 12 years, and I understand why I didn't know. And I appreciate that they protected us from information they thought that was too adult. But it just seemed to me that lots of unhappy accidents were happening in my life, and it made me feel very out of control. And here my dad was this very meaningful person, and this person who cared about intention, apparently, which I didn't even know about. So I think when I learned about what activists call car crashes and the reason for that, it helped me a lot, because it helped me to feel like, oh, I can take some agency in this. And when people drive, they also can take agency if they choose to.
Yeah, I understand that. I wasn't offended or anything.
Okay, good.
No, not at all. So how did your mom react to you getting into this bucket list and everything?
She was very wary of it. Yeah. Because she was there when he wrote it, and we all knew my dad as this big dreamer. And I wasn't like that as far as we knew, and a lot of the reasons I'm alive, and a lot of the wonderful things that have happened in my life have been because of my mom protecting me, and how much she had to do to raise us. And she was much more involved in certain areas than my dad was, obviously. So I was always going to be much more inclined to listen to what she thought I should do. And so I became nervous as well. Like, what is wrong with me? Why am I doing this? And, I was 38. I was newlywed. it made sense that I should be hurrying up to have kids, that I should be caring about putting savings into a house, that, these were things according to the adult rites of passage I should want and I'm supposed to be doing, and that she thought I would be doing, and I thought I would be doing. It wasn't just her. And then I was having this, meanwhile, this existential crisis, because I'm like, why don't I care about those things? Is there something wrong with? Am I broken? Is there something wrong with me? Because I should, because she does, and my stepdad does, and every adult I know cares about that stuff, except my husband, for some reason, did not care about those things. So it really was difficult. I went through a period of wanting to just be more like that, and thinking if only I were more like that, everything would be okay. And so when the list appeared and I had this thing I could do to bring awareness to how my dad died, to also honor him and maybe even reconnect with him, I didn't know at that time, but I also was needing to find out who I really was. And I think what happened was my mom, even though she's more conservative than me, once she figured that out, that she could see it happening in me, then her stance on it shifted completely. And it only took maybe 2 months, honestly.
That's pretty good, though.
Yeah. Well, my mom's also a very emotionally intelligent person. So, of course, she's my mom. So she wants to protect me from disappointment. But she could see the good it was doing for me. And that even, long-term problems with my lack of confidence were suddenly being resolved very quickly. And she's told me she could see I was doing it responsibly. So she really just became one of my biggest supporters very early.
Beautiful. Well, because one of the things that comes to mind is, a lot of people spend their lives creating something because they see what everybody else is doing and not doing what they really want because they never get in touch with that. So to me, it's amazing that you had the ability to say, let me just look at this in a different way. Let me go ahead and do it and just try it. Because a lot of people wouldn't have done that because they are so pigeonholed into, at this age, you're doing this, at this age, you're doing that. And so it's very commendable. So I'm sure you know that about yourself, but make sure you're patting yourself on the back a lot more often to just be the catalyst that other people see, that it's okay to do your dreams. And it may not be a bucket list of somebody, but your dream is your dream, and that it's okay, even if other people see it differently.
That's so beautiful. You're moving me to tears because that's what I needed. I needed somebody to come do that for me.
Yeah. I've had times in my life that I needed somebody to do that for me too. So I appreciate you doing that for all of us.
That's such a beautiful thing when people can find their niche and find a sense of purpose. And I think so often that's what it ends up being, the thing that they needed to guide them to find themselves. They become that for other people.
Yeah. So I appreciate you intensely. I really do.
Thank you.
And I will say, you are a damn good writer. I mean,
Thank you.
because I've read some people's books that, they write and they're good at writing, but it's like, you told the story so compellingly, and like, it was one of those where you could feel you're in there. You're not just reading the book. And so I know you worked at a magazine, but did you have some actual training in writing, or was that just something that came naturally to you?
Well, I have a degree in journalism,
Okay.
so I knew how to write articles. And then somewhere along the way, I don't know whether that was reading literary journals a lot or just memoirs. I became enamored with the essay format. And I just really started loving how essays can be very layered. You could be saying multiple things in one essay, and sometimes it takes further examination to really see what everything the author is using symbols to represent. And then I think a big part of it, quite honestly, is I became a TV recapper. And I started deconstructing TV shows, and this is just on a blog, that anybody, if they wanted to read it, they could. I did it for when I worked for OK Magazine, and then again when I worked for Good Housekeeping, and it was for shows like Lost or Mad Men. I did a little bit True Detective. It was there's the thing that all the shows had in common was they were very complex, and they were the kinds of shows where, I mean, I think they call it smart TV. Like you'd go back and watch it a second time and pick up on little Easter eggs here and there.
Yeah.
And I'm so detail oriented naturally that it was like a natural fit for me to go through and write down everything I was seeing, and then just go in a rabbit hole and research all of the stuff. And then I would turn it into a recap, and that would help people have almost like a Cliff's Notes to the episode. But I think what started happening as I was doing that for, I think, almost 5 years, I started learning from those TV writers. Like, oh, this is how you sprinkle this here and this here and this here, and it means something, but you don't tell them what it means. Like they'll get it subconsciously, and if they're really interested, maybe they'll look into it. So I think that started affecting my writing style. So it got to a point where it was becoming really fun for me to write a story and have it be layered, and have it, and the weird part is, I point out omens in nature and things like that in the book, and moments where I think my dad is talking to me. And those weren't just me putting that in just to spice up the story. Like those were things that really happened because I actually started experiencing the list as though I was on a TV show, like as though I was the character seeing the symbol that, on the show, the character doesn't really see it, the viewer sees it. But that's how I started experiencing my life. So like I was now sort of living in a story. And I think it freed me up a lot, to accept disappointments with the list, to not take things as personally as I used to. Like, let's say someone was going to do a list item and then they backed out at the last minute. I could say, okay, well, wasn't for them. Like they weren't aligned with this. And as I began seeing my life as a story, I started to realize, oh, when the bad stuff happens, that's okay too. And I think you mentioned that at the beginning of this episode, how everything in your life is there to teach you. And later you learn, oh, that thing that was so painful actually gave me a detour and helped me to become the thing I had an intention to be. And without the painful obstacle, like the obstacle is the way, without the painful obstacle, I wouldn't get there. So it helped me to really, because as someone who was very sensitive, and I think someone told me once I had, like a doctor said I had rejection related depression, that was when I would have an episode if I felt rejected by something or somebody. So now I would flip it and be like, well, this is okay because it's a story. And it could have like just a bit of detachment. So yeah, and I think getting into my writer mode helped me to do that even more, because now I'm starting to piece together even some pretty traumatic experiences in my life, and I'm seeing how they connect like a puzzle into some of the happier moments, and how necessary, like in many ways, they were almost more necessary into shaping me into the person I was becoming.
Yeah, definitely. It's like, because for me, it's like I've got tons of stories, and the thing that I've learned from each one of them, not right away, of course, but later on, when you look back, or when I look back, I can say, oh, if I hadn't learned that thing, if I hadn't had that experience happen to me, I wouldn't have been strong enough to be able to do this here as I'm going to do something else. And, a lot of times it's like we sit back, and this may not be you, but some people that are watching or listening, it may be, it was for me. I would just want to be able to magically twitch my nose like Bewitched and be where I wanted to be. I didn't want to do all the things to get there. And then when you really get into it, you realize that it's the getting there that's the best part. And a lot of times we kind of want to skirt around all those things, but the delicious joy that we can actually gain from having learned the lesson and share that with someone else and help them have a better life, and and our lives get better by going through those processes too, even no matter how uncomfortable they may be in the moment. But it's a beautiful thing of how life just plays out, and like you said, doing it as a story and being able to see yourself as a character. And I know I've read books before that one of the things they'll tell you to do is to write your story as if you're a character. And
Oh,
then that way it's kind of in a way so that you're almost pre-paving, so you can kind of dream a little bit and put yourself in that future spot and write that as a story like today. And it helps you to, I guess, go from the eventual thing and make it seem plausible, because you're kind of almost writing the story of being there already. And so that's kind of a little bit about what you did, because as you were going through all of this stuff and writing it as a story, and like I said, I loved your writing and your writing style. It was very, very compelling to want to, I want to know what's next, what's next, what's next.
well, that's what it felt like when I was doing it.
Yeah.
I really, I wanted the reading experience to feel exactly how it felt when I was doing it.
Yeah. So did you write it, like each thing that you did you write that section, or was it something that you had to wait till you'd gotten through it a little bit before you would write that?
In the very beginning, I was writing each list item that I accomplished as a blog post.
Okay.
And I had an experience early on with a different agent where we tried to pitch it based on those. And that was like, those were the writing samples that we had. And it didn't work, I think, mostly because they couldn't figure out, well, what's the arc of this story? What is she going to learn? And also, she's brand new at this.
Yeah.
Like someone said, if this feels more like a blog than a book. And yeah, probably because it was at that time.
Yeah.
And my blog posts were just as detailed and lengthy as my TV recaps. It was just too much. I had not figured out yet the brevity that you need for a book chapter. And those are sort of a rough draft, I guess, for what it would end up being. And at the end of the first year, when it turned out that I couldn't sell this as just an idea with, like I said, just the blog post as a sample, my agent at the time said, well, I think you need to write 100 pages. And then I lost my job 2 months later, which in normal circumstances, I was laid off. It wasn't for cause, but it was like, I would have been devastated. That would have been the worst thing that ever happened to me. I wouldn't know how I could continue living, because that job was my whole life for 7 years. And even beyond that, other places I worked, it was my whole life. So to now be in a position where, I have a severance and I have free time, clearly this was meant to be. I'm going to sit down and write those 100 pages. So I ended up writing 250 because brevity is not my strong suit. And it was just too much. And I gave it to the agent. He's like, nope, this is too much for us. But I was so organized about it. It was the whole first year of doing the list that I was writing about, even though I was now in year 2. I gave it to 11 people to read, like beta readers. I joined a writer's group. I had so much feedback and everybody was telling me what was good about it. But they also were saying, I think there's too much here. And I didn't listen.
Too much detail?
Yeah, too much detail. Okay. Well, I think part of the problem was you don't really know your growth as the protagonist of a story until you have finished living it. Mm-hmm. It's difficult to step back far enough to understand that that's the story. And I even needed to hire a book proposal editor later on who could teach me that, because she's like, this is about you and your dad, and it's about your growth living out his dreams. And it's also sort of about you and your husband, because that's part of your life now. But anything that does not pertain to those relationships needs to be cut back. So, there's going to be less in there of, there's lots of people in my life who I love, who I'm really close to. I couldn't show you the full them because it was going to be very, very long. Yeah. And, that's the one thing I regret about that, because I would like to have a lot more about those people in there.
Maybe you need to do a prequel or something.
I need to do another book that pays tribute to everybody. That's what I really need to do.
I know for me, if I was writing the book, I would say, oh my gosh, well, if I don't mention my cousin in this, they're going to think I don't love them if I mention this. Yeah.
Yeah. So the way I did it was just, if a person did a list item, I might say a little bit about them, but mostly I'm just talking about them doing the list item.
Yeah.
So you're not going to know many details about my cousin, my stepbrother, whoever it might be. You'll just know, oh, here's this person who's there doing this. And then a lot of times the list items were helped by strangers too. So usually if it were a stranger, I would give a little bit more of a physical appearance because I want you to understand as the reader, I'm meeting them for the first time.
Yeah.
You know, so I'm studying them and figuring out who they are. We don't do that with people we already know and love.
Right.
I don't think. So I don't anyway. So, you know, the thing that was happening in that early draft now, I think in retrospect, was I didn't have that growth yet to understand what the story was. And also, I was afraid. I was afraid of getting into those details of that relationship with my dad. There was so much that was still healing that I didn't know how to write about because it was still happening. It was still inside of me. So instead, what I gave them was just, you know, tangents into F. Scott Fitzgerald or Jackie Robinson, or, you know, just I kept finding these people I found heroic who had done a list item or were like loosely related to a list item. And it was always someone who, like, if my dad were alive, he would love hearing about it and he would tell me things about them. So almost they were like proxies for my dad that I just kept discovering along the way. But that was meaningful to me. It wasn't necessarily meaningful to the reader. So there's still a little bit of that in there because I think my love of history and culture was part of my bond with my dad. So it kind of, because he was an American studies major. You know, he loved our country. So it has to be in there. Sacagawea has to be in there to some degree, but not all of it, you know.
Right. So I know you still weren't that old when your father died. So you got some time with your father, even though it was kind of hit and miss a little bit. So when you look back at the time that you got to spend with your dad, what is your favorite memory that comes to mind?
Oh, it's my first memory.
Okay.
Like my first ever memory was from when I was 4 years old. And my mom and my dad took me to see my first movie, which was Song of the South. And I know that's not it's not a great movie to talk about these days. It has a lot of problems. But there was a song in the movie called Zippity Doo Dah. And my dad used to love to hold my hand while I would skip, and he would sing that song. And you know, it's to a point where I've really debated getting a bluebird tattoo on my shoulder because it just so sums up who he was. You know, just look for the joy, look for the guidance. And you know, again, that ties into that theme of someone who's lost and how you don't have to be.
Right. Well, that just kind of gives me chills too, because I can visualize that movie myself. You know, I'm aging myself there too. But because and to hear that song in my mind and you skipping along to it, it just I don't know, that's just so cool to know. I love it. And you know, the thing too, when you think about that and it makes you happy, that's a wonderful thing to be able to have that experience in your mind with happiness with your dad. And it's funny because one of my favorite memories of my father are that he would keep us on Saturdays, my sister and I, and he would, because he didn't like to cook or anything. So he would take us to this little fair thing, little carnival, and so we could play and get tired, right? And then he would stop by the store, a little convenience store, and he'd give us one of those little Hostess fried apple pies
Oh,
and a
I love
Coke.
those.
And that was our lunch. But we thought Daddy was the best because we got the apple pies and the Coke for lunch. Mom, once she found out later when we said stuff about it, she was mortified that that's what he'd fed us for lunch. But it's one of my fondest memories.
Yeah, doesn't that seem like that's always the case?
Yeah.
Like the mothers, though, like I said, my mom kept me alive.
Yeah. Yeah, who knows if it been left up to my dad, we'd probably always had Hostess apple pies. I remember him fixing us tomato soup and grilled cheese too, so that he at least did those two things.
Yeah, I mean, moms are fun too.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
know,
yeah, they can be. They can be. Yeah,
that's
that's
such
for
a
sure.
sweet memory. I mean, and I think maybe that is especially true when you have divorced parents and you have that
Hmm.
special time with your dad, because it's like, it's almost like he has to concentrate fun. You know,
Yeah,
like let's make sure this time that you have with me is wonderful and is memorable and is fun, because I don't get to put that into every single day anymore for you. So,
yeah, yeah. I love that. So we're getting close to time. So is there anything, and I know we didn't get into all your bucket list, but I'm going to have in the description of the podcast, I'll have a link to your book and everything for them. Any links that you want to share with them, I will put in there so people can get in touch with you and reach out. But is there one thing, as since there's a lot we didn't cover, is there one thing in particular that you would like to people know about you, your dad, or your book?
as I was doing the list, I sort of started developing these new life philosophies,
Hmm.
just because the experiences I was having were so out there to me. They were so different from what I thought I should be doing or would be doing at that age. And I really had to develop new ways of looking at life in order to tackle them and make them happen. And sometimes I would start to feel like, I think there's some divine intervention here. The way that happened was a little too easy, or somebody was in the right place at just the right time who was there to help me, and I was picking up on it a lot more. And one of the strangest things I started noticing was that anytime I went at a list item with arrogance or thinking I'll do this quickly, or I have it in me, I already know what I need to do, or even like, ugh, I don't feel like doing this today, whenever I would do it like that, it would fail miserably. Like it just would not work. But whenever I went towards a list item with kindness and generosity and really paying attention to the person who was helping me and listening to them and learning from them, and in situations where I might be envious of other people's good fortune in my life, instead of treating them differently, promoting them and doing
Hmm.
all I could to help them to have more of it. One thing I started learning was the idea of abundance. And that really, my idea that I had my whole life, that there's only so much, to go around, and we have to compete with other people in order to be successful. And if that person has it, then I don't, and I can't get it because they took it from me. Like I used to look at it like that.
Hmm.
Now I started seeing it as, oh wait, like there's more than enough for everyone. There's actually like a surplus of opportunity out there, and everybody's going to have enough. And actually, when I encourage opportunity and luck and abundance in others, suddenly it starts exploding in my
Right.
life too. And I don't think a lot of people know that. I certainly didn't know that. And I was just sort of by practicality in a position now where I had to think that way. And I remember I had a friend who was a counselor, and I was in a particularly low place with the list. And she said, here's what I want you to do. Every single day, I want you to say, thank you, God, for the abundance. Thank you, God, for the abundance. And she said, and you're going to say that until it's true. Like you and that's a thing you can do at any time in your life, no matter
Hmm.
what you're going through, no matter what is upsetting you. If you're feeling guilt, if you're feeling rejected, if you're feeling hurt, you can do that, and you can actually believe it. Because one thing I started learning is that when we make a choice to give to other people, we are replenished. We're
Hmm.
we're sort of like meant to be channels for this good energy, and there's a flow to that. So if you stop isolating and protecting yourself, and you stop competing with, how everybody else looks around you, which I think we're getting into a lot these days with social media. If you
Yeah.
stop doing that, and instead you're like this towards life, and you're like, okay, give me more so I can give it out. It's almost like I looked at it as a horseshoe, like you're standing underneath of it. You're letting go of everything that's not serving you so that you can give, and then God is going to keep replenishing you, because that's what we're here to do. Like if you have a talent, you're supposed to use it to help other people. Like that's why it's there. It's not just so
Right.
you can like look at yourself and admire it. Oh, I'm
Right.
so good at violin. Awesome. I
Yeah.
enjoy that.
Yeah. With nobody to listen, that's not very fun.
Yeah, you have to share your music.
Right. Yeah. Well, thank you for that. I love that. And it makes me think, because you said you had your dad was following all these different gurus kind of thing, that you were kind of channeling your dad with his positivity and his abundance of things that he was researching and looking into. So that's beautiful, beautiful.
And
All
I
right.
mean, it's real. It's not just some wacky ideas somebody
Oh
had.
yeah, definitely, definitely. I'm definitely a proponent of the law of attraction and the vibration, and I look at it as a boomerang. If whatever you throw out comes back, whether you're throwing out good or you're throwing out bad, it's all going to come back to you in some way.
Yeah.
Maybe not exactly the way you sent it out, but it's going to come back.
I mean, I'm not someone who thinks that it's that way with everything, though.
Yeah,
Like some terrible things really do happen that
yeah,
I didn't necessarily create, but
right.
yeah, in general, it's just an easier way to go through life.
Definitely, definitely. All right. So, what I want to just tell everybody real quick, I want to remind you to make sure that you um, like, subscribe, and share, and that you leave a comment for Laura if there's something that you want to know from her. If there's something you want to know from me, just make sure you leave a comment and we'll get back to you. I promise we will. And then I'll leave you with these final words. The best way to predict the future is create it. So, what are you creating? And you be blessed, and I'll see you next time. Mwah.